Let's start off with Dhasu question. Why do you think India is so corrupt?
Oh, good gosh, that really is a Dhasu question. How much time do you have? Most societies see people moving from agriculture out. We are seeing people moving from agriculture into precarious informality and now increasingly going back to agriculture. Every time a tax break goes for the middle class, this is a welcome contribution to the Indian economy. A so-called freebie, which in my view are welfare schemes that are announced. Oh my God, this is a freebie that will fall into the trap of corruption. In school education, there used to be a position called CRCC, Cluster Resource Center Coordinator. This is how they describe this. आप क्या करते हैं? Madam, हमारा तो complete rest in comfortable condition. Ambedkar says he worries about constitutional morality. We've kind of imposed democracy on a society that is fundamentally undemocratic.
I remember when Lalu Prasad Yadav became Chief Minister of Bihar, one of his biggest political moves was to humiliate IAS officers.
Pliant district magistrate or a pliant secretary kept his or her position. One that wasn't so would be transferred out within 3 months. We have got so disenchanted with the state that we would rather it just drops a little bit of cash and leave everything else and hope that somehow that will lead us to the pathway of being a global superpower. It's not going to happen. Lose your disenchantment, use democratic means to hold the state accountable and demand more of the state.
We journalists love politics. The Modis, the Rahuls, the Mamatas, the fights, the drama. The news is dominated by this. But what affects the lives of the common man is far more mundane. Low-level corruption, small-time babus, budgetary allocation, taxes. It is the nuts and bolts of governance that decides the quality of our life. To unpack this, I have on this episode with me Yamini Aiyar. Till 2024, Yamini was the president of the Centre for Policy Research, then one of India's leading think tanks. Today, she is a senior visiting fellow at Brown University. As you'll see on this episode, there are few people who know more about the workings of the Indian state than Yamini. So I'm very pleased to have her on this governance episode of the Scroll.in podcast. Hi, Yamini.
Hi, Sir Shoaib. Thank you so much for having me. It's an absolute privilege.
Same. Let's start off with Dhasu question.
You're putting me on the spot before we even begin.
Before we even start. Why do you think India is so corrupt?
Oh, good gosh, that really is a Dhasu question. How much time do you have? Look, it's a question on all our minds. And you will...
Exactly, we discuss it so much, right?
Why is India corrupt? In some senses, like the drive, you just said that we journalists are all excited by politicians, the individual personalities and the way in which they conduct their party politics. We citizens are completely obsessed by corruption. And, think about some of the major shifts that we've had in our politics, even over the last decade and a half. Corruption was in some senses the heart of it. India against corruption, that then kind of brings the Aam Aadmi Party, a whole new political party suddenly emerges onto the scene in what we always thought at that point the general wisdom was that these are entrenched party structures that have now got embedded, and this completely...
Which then gets embroiled in corruption.
Charges, right? This kind of muffler man shows up and what did he show up on the back of? Corruption. What did Prime Minister Modi show up on as candidate Modi? He told us that there'll be minimum government, maximum governance, and the Indian electorate at some level was kind of feeling that the vast amounts of corruption of the UPA that, was kind of the hawa of the time, a little bit of democracy going away with a strong man might solve the corruption problem. So, we citizens are obsessed with corruption. And you will, look, there's a whole range of reasons why we are so corrupt, and it's poli-sci 101 at some level. But maybe we can be a little provocative and ask ourselves a different question. Are we corrupt because now it has become the binding logic of our society? In some ways, the fact that the Indian state is corrupt, and I'll roll on one more layer onto it, corrupt and incompetent, which none of your viewers are going to challenge me when I say this. These are two accepted truths about the Indian state. Has it created a vicious cycle such that we entrench ourselves in that corruption, and that corruption itself becomes a driving force of everyday social life, and we'll complain and rail about it? Often we'll even have our own versions of mini transitions and big political moments around it. But essentially it has become the driving logic of how our society functions. Elites, you and I, a large percentage of people who are listening to your podcast, how much do we actually engage the state? And every time you're stopped on the street by a cop because you may have skipped a red light, you can legitimately pay a bribe and say, "Arey yaar, this is the Indian state, all these cops are corrupt, so I'll pay a bribe and get around it." We contributed into that vicious cycle,
and then you'll
right?
go back home and complain about
corruption, and then look for an anti-politics machine that will get us out of that corruption. We will say all politicians are corrupt. Think about one of the driving narratives behind the India Against Corruption at the time, which was essentially a claim that all these politicians are corrupt, sab babu corrupt hai, sab politicians corrupt hai, sare neta log kharab hai. In a sense, we wanted to depoliticize our politics in order to address this problem of corruption. And actually, you created a political party. I'm not making any comments about what they did or did not do, but it found itself embroiled in a sense in that corruption. And even a sympathetic ear to what happened will say, well, that is politics. You can't do politics without corruption because of the nature of political financing. All I'm trying to say is that when we ask ourselves why is India so corrupt, it's an important question to unpack in terms of figuring out the roots of it, but this is our reality. And maybe we need to shift the terms of the discourse to ask ourselves, what is it about this reality that is entrenching this? Why has it become the driving force of society? And the reason it's important to ask that is because it might push us then to look for slightly better answers, rather than, as we have done, seek clutches that in some way seek to depoliticize. So, when we talk about the Babu Log, you say you want to remove Babu Log from politics. Mm-hmm. But the whole core function of a democracy is for the executive and the bureaucracy to be accountable to the politician, and the politician to be accountable to the people. And when you seek to kind of insulate the government from politics, you're essentially taking away voice of the people from bureaucracy, and that's exactly the opposite of what a democratic country should seek. Or we go seeking strongman leadership, which is also the opposite of democracy. So to close that cycle as a provocation, when we say, why is India so corrupt, we always look for the nodes of power that are feeding this corruption, and we seek to try and rein those nodes of power in. But I think we are doing it at the risk of stripping ourselves from the one most valuable thing that we have as a society, which is our democracy, which is the core essence of how in a society that has such deep inequality baked into its own inherent logic, you still have the space for every Indian to have a voice and a vote. And we risk taking that away in our conversations sometimes.
You brought up a very important point. When you say depoliticization, I would actually even want to use a stronger word, that it's a de-democratization, right?
Absolutely.
People say that, to end corruption, you gave the two most common solutions. One is to have a strong man, a very undemocratic kind of thing, this guy who's almost like a quasi-dictator or a king, or to technocratize policy making, right?
Exactly.
To have a group of quote-unquote experts who will then decide policy without any or very little democratic input. And that's a solution which is, it seems to me, far worse than any problem that was thought of in the beginning, right?
Let me tell you one really revealing conversation I once had with a bureaucrat, an IAS officer. One of the things that I'm very passionate about and that I spent a lot of years working on is deepening the capacities and capabilities of local governments in India. I'm sure we'll talk about it at greater length later in the conversation, but just to give a quick intro, I strongly believe that India is too large and too centralized to be governed sensibly, and we are one of the few countries at the scale at which we operate that are in some senses a federal country. We are a union of states, and we completely forget that in most other functional governing structures, including non-democratic structures like China, local governments play a really important role, and our panchayats and municipalities are the most least relevant piece of part of our governance structure. And in the course of my work, one of the things that you constantly heard the bureaucrats, the technocrats, the IAS, who think of themselves as the all-powerful Indian state, kind of speaking of local governments and panchayats and municipalities in very disparaging ways. And in one conversation where I was having with an IAS officer, he put it to perfection. He said, "Yamini ji, aap boliye jo bhi bolna hai. Why should I give my scheme to those corrupt panchayats?" And in a sense, he was talking about a dilemma that he had, which is I as the purveyor of taxpayers' money have a responsibility to implement a scheme, and the local government is extremely corrupt. If I implement my scheme in such a way that I'm giving discretion and power to the local government, it will all go into corruption. But effectively, and in a way, he's articulating his challenge from the perspective of achieving the end goal that we all want, which is service to the people and taxpayers' money spent.
From his point of view, he's being genuine. Right, yeah. He's being honest.
But he is articulating something that is fundamentally undemocratic. Whether or not the panchayats are deeply corrupt, we can hold that conversation for a moment. But these are elected bodies representing the last mile of governance, the heart of where the people are. And we are saying, I'm going to centralize because I don't want to give taxpayers' money, my scheme, to those corrupt panchayats. So that logic of insulating and taking away from the core function of democracy, deliberation, dialogue, and accountability from the bottom up, often we stake away because we are worried about quote-unquote corruption. Upar kya ho raha hai is a whole other story. Every level of government will tell you, I can't get anything done because the next level of government is too corrupt.
Everybody's corrupt but me.
Yes, right. Of course. Right. Meanwhile, I'll quietly sneak in a bribe to not have to pay for having cut a red light, because we are also a society that has always little bit of chaos. ऐसे तो होता ही है ना?
ऐसे तो होता ही है. So it seems like this is a catch-all, right? You can just spin this thing on anyone, and this is a very important point that you raise, this devolution using the idea of corruption, right? So just because you're going to maybe lose 20% of the money, you're really going to impact governance in some ways, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think that if you think about a lot of the political conversation that we are having in India right now, right, like one nation, one election, one nation, one grade, one nation, one everything, the one nationism, it's often presented to us in precisely this way, in that efficiency requires a certain oneness, and too much democracy can lead to too much chaos. So how do we ensure? It's not an anti-democratic argument in that sense. That you can see that there's a kind of technocratic logic that is being built into it, but effectively what it is convincing, it's as our disenchantment essentially with the state and with its corrupt ways. I'm not taking away from those realities, have kind of got us caught in this vicious cycle where we are constantly seeing, in some senses, a conflation between the problem and the sets of solutions that are meant to solve the problem, that we are now conflating as the problem itself. So, there's a very lovely paper that was one of the first things that deeply influenced some of my thinking, that is written by the economist Land Pritchett and Michael Woolcock. And the title of the paper sums it all. And I've done a lot of work with Land since, and he always has papers that have these excellent titles. You don't need to read the rest of the paper because the paper will just tell you the core of it. And that particular
paper.
It's a
bit of an academic art that.
It's an academic art that creates headlines without being headlines.
Right.
But it is the solution when the solution is the problem. So, and this is precisely at the heart of how we as a society have now begun to debate corruption. But I'll extend that more broadly, begun to debate the state as such. And in some ways that has brought us to this pass where we often flirt with the authoritarian hope. Can we be like China was kind of a lot of what we used to talk about in the run up to 2014. Maybe a little bit of democracy might fall by the wayside, but we will get more efficiency, better government, and therefore a better society, a more prosperous and wealthier society. Well,
except a lot of data shows that China, at least fiscally, is very federal, right?
It is, yes, it has strong local governments, and one part of the story of the Chinese kind of economic transformation was about how local governments were empowered and incentivized to kind of compete with each other, both to attract investments and to attract resources, and local economic development was very much part and parcel of that structure. Ours, of course, is a lot more centralized. But I think the comparison is a hard one at one level because it's a very different context. The one-party structure is a very different context to our multi-party democracy, and the nature of our societies are also quite different. However, the principle that you cannot have democracy through a centralized structure, but one that is far more localized and that responds to local realities is an extremely important one that we forget in our desire to go to one nationism because we are getting tired of the chaos of democracy. I guess in the Chinese context, you wouldn't have had the same type of chaos. It is a different chaos.
Yeah, I think in the China example, that's a good distinction to draw. I think there maybe the top leaders, they feel more secure devolving because beyond a point, power is never going to go out of the hand.
So think about it. It's deconcentrated power rather than elected governments that have the capacity to self-govern, right? So when we did the 73rd and 74th amendments, these are elected governments, even though at the panchayat level, these are not always, except in some exceptions of some states, these are not fought along party lines, but at the district level, these are fought along party lines. So it's a different, these are elected governments that could be multi-party, you could have a different party at the Zilla Parishad level and a different party at the state level, and these levels of government are supposed to be empowered to operate as independent levels of government, just like the state government. And in this, frankly, it is, when we talk about federalism in India, we often, and mea culpa, we are talking a lot, especially in the current moment, about center-state relations. But state governments, even those that speak most loudly about states' rights, with very few exceptions, have done everything within their power not to devolve power to local governments. So we are a remarkably centralized country for being a democratic country.
In fact, the 73rd, 74th Amendment, which introduced this third tier, so to speak, what is the practical application of that? How successful has it been?
Very at one level and absolutely not at another, okay? And with the caveat that this is India, so there's huge amounts of state variation. It's been very successful in that it has genuinely created a competitive electoral space at the grassroots. Panchayat elections are heavily contested.
And in fact, they have the largest turnout, usually much more than state or federal elections.
And that representational element of it is now deeply baked into the politics and to our societal structures. The reservation system, it has its limitations, but it has also very, very effectively brought in.
Sorry, could you just explain the reservation system?
So the reservation system, so the 73rd and 74th Amendment essentially had 1/3 seats reserved for women and SC/ST. States have been doing different things. So Bihar, for instance, was one of the pioneers in moving towards 50% reservation of seats for women, but it does it via rotation. So the constituencies are rotated at every 5 years. But what it has done in that process, so the rotation has brought its own problems because it kind of breaks the accountability cycle. But setting that aside, it has brought
because there's no chance of a re-election for a person.
Because it'll rotate out,
so she's
right?
not going to work as hard.
And I'll come to the critique in a second. But you do have a very large number of I think this is probably the largest number of women that go through an electoral process to enter into into government
in the world.
I mean, our numbers always push
we
us all the way up. But it is quite phenomenal. And in that sense, I don't think there's any other experiment like this in the world. And it has genuinely transformed the nature of our governance structure from the bottom up. So in that sense, it has been a huge success. Some states, Kerala was a pioneer that kind of led the way almost, and Karnataka too was quite far ahead. West Bengal to some degree, Rajasthan and Maharashtra to some degree too. But Kerala is always seen as kind of the pioneer. They have done a lot more in terms of actually empowering our panchayats.
As in giving them money.
Giving them so the way so the term that used to be used was the 3 Fs: funds, functions, functionaries. Think about it. You can't be a functional level of any organization or government without having funds to do things, without having clearly demarcated functions. So what is my role and what over which I have powers and jurisdictions, and functionaries, i.e. people, to get things done. So so the big framing of devolution was essentially a question of devolving powers within this framing of funds, functions, functionaries at appropriate levels of government to be able to perform functions that have been assigned to them within their jurisdictions. And on that, we have been remarkably is not even the word, we have actively disempowered and done everything we can not to empower local bodies with these 3 basic foundational elements or characteristics of what
makes. And when you say we, you mean state governments?
I mean state
largely,
governments.
Right?
So the constitutional amendments empowered states to do this. So states were expected to then both have their own legislation and rules to actually do the devolution. And just like we have a structure of the Finance Commission. So let me take a step back actually for your viewers, because even though for me this is everyday bread and butter, I realize that a lot of people don't know this. The Indian Constitution is a remarkably centralized one at some level, right? And that centralization of the Indian state constitution.
I think you can remove at some level. The Indian Constitution is a very centralized document.
No,
I think
at some level. I'll take
right.
The reason I say some level is the following. We have a strong central government that is, in comparison with many other federal powers, much stronger because of various powers that are given to the states, set against a backdrop of partition, the nation building project, etc. This was, in their wisdom, this is what our founding fathers and mothers conceptualized. And one of the most interesting powers that they gave to the state, right, to the union government, the central government, was the power to redraw state boundaries. Now, very few, actually no other federal system has this power, but it was at the heart of what made for the political project of India possible in the following way, that India, with all of its diversities of language, of ethnicity, of region, and also of religion, the core element of our modern nation building project was to be a democracy with all of this diversity, and to allow this diversity and heterogeneity to cohere within the imagination of a nation state. So you are Bengali, you speak Bengali, and you are Indian. I'm half Tamil, half Punjabi, married to a Malayali, and I am Indian. And I'm all of these things within this idea of being Indian. In some senses, our federalism was essentially designed to protect these subnational national identities and our political aspirations of these identities within this larger framing of the nation state. So it wasn't to protect territorial boundaries as such, it was to protect this set of multiplicities of identities. And it allowed, therefore, the union government to respond to demands and aspirations of and anxieties of ethnicity, of religion, of region, of language that would consistently boil up. After all, unlike the European project, the nation-state project, we were what Yogendra Yadav and Stepan Letz, etc., have defined as a state-nation project, where these multiplicities of identities could cohere. And because the union government had the capacity to redraw boundaries, it was able to respond in this way. So think about the State Reorganization Act. We were able to redraw boundaries of states on the back of linguistic mobilization that had emerged. How do you protect and preserve linguistic identities within this broader structure of the nation state? So that's how the political project of India sort of survived with all of its diversities. And that's my greatest objection to the one nationism. I cannot be one without all of these manys. And so the one nation cannot be one nation, one language, one nation, one ethnicity, one nation, one, and everybody else can stay around, but as long as you accept second-class citizenship, we are one nation because we are all these many, and that was at the heart of the modern nation-building political project.
Like a unitary state is an un-Indian idea.
It is, to me, it is a completely un-Indian idea. In the context of the administrative and fiscal architecture, unlike, say, the United States, where states came together to pool their sovereignty, we were a sovereign that was sharing its sovereignty. And in that articulation, the intergovernmental relationship was designed such that the union government had sets of powers that it was then devolving to state governments to function as independent units of government. And it was exactly the same structure that brings in this, that was baked into the third tier. So the state governments now have to share some of their powers and responsibilities with local governments. So it isn't that local governments existed as elected bodies formally recognized within the constitution and they are coming together to pool their sovereignty. It is that the sovereignty was being devolved and shared. And so in some senses, it is sort of based on the goodwill of the sovereign to share its sovereignty. And the constitutional amendment lays down a set of terms on the basis of which this was to be done. In terms of fiscal federalism, that is where the Finance Commission comes in. The Central Finance Commission determines, it aggregates revenue, and then it makes a determination on how revenue is to be shared among states. The same idea was constitutionally mandated for states to do with local governments. Every state was supposed to have a state finance commission that would determine both the revenue raising powers of local governments as well as the revenue sharing model based on a formulae between state governments and local governments. Now, of course, state governments mostly didn't do it. And, I think part of the challenge has always been is that we always thought about this as a administrative slicing and dicing. So let's figure out how we work through these 3 Fs. One of the first policy projects I was involved in when I was at the World Bank was in thinking through on the basis of first principles how you would, so take education, right? A local government is not going to do curriculum, is not going to be able to set standards, determine curriculum. That may well be the job of the national government or the state government. But the local government is best placed to know whether the teacher has shown up in the school or not. So the local government should have greater powers over service matters. So hiring and firing, contractual, the whole Panchayat Shikshak experiment kind of showed that you can potentially bake in accountability if you empower the local government in that way. So, it was like a kind of how do you take a function that government is expected to do and then break it down through its different layers and see what level. We call it the principle of subsidiarity. But ultimately, power sharing is a deeply political project. Right. And, it has always been, to me, it's been amply clear now over time that and that's where we have really failed to where this conversation began about local governments. Has it been a success or a failure? It's been a success on the representational front in that it's brought in a large number of ordinary Indians into the political process, into government. But its biggest failure is that it hasn't converted into a robust level of government where citizens and that level of government knows and expects to function in a particular way. So when states don't set up state finance commissions, do you see panchayats jumping up and down and going to the streets and making it a political issue? Municipalities, in fact, they do what we do as citizens, which is to do this vicious cycle of accountability.
Like it's not like a party is ever going to lose power in the state because they didn't set up a state finance
But think
commission.
about it. If even today, where we have a big kind of open question about centralization in our polity and our administration, if the government of India were not to, at the appropriate time, constitutionally mandated, set up a central finance commission, even BJP states would be on the streets, right? It's an expected norm and function now of the government, and it is to be done, it gets done. But exactly the same norm is not followed at the state level. So I would argue that our local government project has not anchored itself in the political system and in the imaginary of the citizen as the appropriate level of government for the delivery of core functions that is within their jurisdiction. Because when we did the 73rd and 74th Amendment, along with the union, the concurrent and the state list, we introduced another schedule that basically articulated what the core functions of the local governments were to be. We very clearly say that the local government is responsible for local planning, for economic development and social justice. So functions have been broadly articulated. It was for the states then to break it down into a more detailed set of core functions along with funds and functionaries, all of which have not been done. And so as citizens, we don't necessarily see this as the core unit for demanding and extracting accountability for claim making for public services. It serves much more as a conduit to the higher levels of government, and therefore it has failed in performing its core function in our governance architecture, not for its own fault, but because in the process of our politics and perhaps our society tends to move much more comfortably in the direction of centralization than it does in the direction of decentralization, particularly from the bottom up.
In fact, where this is really egregious, Yamini, I think is India has failed to develop local city governments even in big cities, right? I mean, right now, I think after the revolution in Kathmandu, the mayor of, after the revolution in Nepal, the mayor of Kathmandu is a leading candidate for prime minister. You see this in the West all the time where, the mayors of big cities often are in line for office in national politics. This very rarely happens in India. Our cities, in fact, till very recently in Mumbai, it didn't even have, I think for many years, it didn't have an elected corporation, which is really remarkable, right? Because cities have power, cities have a lot of population in India, yet they aren't being able to develop a sort of local politics of its own.
So two things there. One, I think the real puzzle is this. So the 73rd, 74th Amendment come in the early 1990s. And it is in that phase, even as Indian politics, party politics is becoming much more regionalized and decentralized. In some senses, the coalition era, what we call the third party system, was sort of the heyday of India's federalism acquiring a certain degree of maturity, right? But think about what was happening to party politics. It was increasingly getting centralized. So look at the contradictions, right? You have a much greater regionalization and therefore federalization. And in some sense, and in that phase, national elections looked a lot more like state elections that were coming together to form a national government. Yet parties were becoming much more personalized. I mean, the Congress party had already gone through this history from the 1970s onwards, but getting much more personalized and much more centralized as inner party democracy was also kind of was atrophying. Perhaps it never existed. Many of these were parties that were kind of in their early phases at that stage. But so you have a very centralized politics and a governance architecture whose logic was pushing you to decentralize. So you go through this, but the two are not meeting. So, where is the incentive? If a party structure, if in that party structure, the chances of your becoming a cabinet minister are near zero if you start your politics as a sarpanch, you will, it is not part and parcel of the hierarchy of the party. You're not going to get those kinds of outcomes,
right? Yeah.
And so it's sort of the logic of our party system, the logic of our bureaucratized governance system together came to essentially make our local governments, city governments and rural governments, nothing but at best convenient post offices for implementation. And from a citizen's point of view, they'll take what they get. It is, of course, very important to have representatives, elected representatives on the ground. There were sites both for claim making, but that claim making was largely to serve broadly as a conduit to other levels of government through which to access government services, rather than as functional levels of government that were accountable to citizens for service delivery. So to go back to where we began, are you surprised then that there will be high levels of corruption at the local government level, where you've broken that core cycle of accountability, and it gets further entrenched then by the IAS officer saying, why should I empower that local government? It is basically just all corrupt. So the citizen also is now voting for the local government for some other reasons. It might be representative, it might be about political, it might be about politics, it could be about a whole set of other things, but it isn't really with the expectation of accountability for service delivery. And you get a deeply corrupt state when the state is not held accountable for its core purpose, that is of ensuring that it delivers on basic rights of citizens, basic socio-economic rights.
Break down for our viewers, Yamini, what this centralization means for development in India. How, give us an example of how this, messes with our development.
Okay, I'm going to tell this story to you using my favorite story that I use all the time, but it so vividly explains this that I'm going to, at the risk of repeating myself. One of the things that in 2008, I had the privilege of joining the Center for Policy Research, and we set up a research group there called the Accountability Initiative. It was at a time when, the story of corruption and India's broke governance, in a sense, had finally kind of mobilized some really important innovation.
UPA 2.
This is UPA 1, when we were building this rights-based welfare state, and a lot of the ideation and experimentation came from the grassroots up through social movements, the right to information movement being central. They experimented with this idea of social audits. But at the heart of this was essentially an attempt to shift the normative basis on which the state and citizen interact on the ground. Not one where the state is responding to elite interests, but to empower citizens with rights, with legal entitlements, and sites like social audits, the Gram Sabha, to place demands on the state for accountability. So if I have not received, if on the books of the muster roll it says I have worked for a program for 100 days and you're only paying me equivalent of 10 days, then I am demanding direct accountability for this gap of for a response to this corruption. So it was in that phase that we were trying to understand how the structures of local government are working in school education. And my colleagues and I started doing these expenditure tracking surveys to understand how monies flow through the system, what actually reaches on the ground at the last mile, so in the school, in the health center where expenditures actually happen.
Tracking every rupee from Delhi right to the grassroots.
It's hard to track every rupee, but yes, broadly that was the idea. And we found we found a school in Purnia in Bihar, and this school there was a tree, there were children, there was a teacher. So it was a school. Some teaching learning was happening. Okay, there was no building. Turned out that I'm talking about 2013 or so, 12, 13. There was a whole Excel sheet in the planning document. In the Excel sheet, there was a whole line item called building list school. This was one of those building list schools that were awaiting their building grant to come from the state coffers, actually Government of India coffers, far, far away. For various bureaucratic red tape reasons, it hadn't yet reached. But it was a fully functional school in that the core purpose of a school is to teach children. There was a teacher, there were children, they were sitting under a tree and things were going on. Now, because of this mindset that I'm not going to decentralize to my panchayat because the panchayats are all corrupt, we conflate, and again I'll quote Land Pritchett because he gave me this lovely phrase, accounting for accountability. So everything requires a paper trail. Like a good auditor, it should all be documented on paper. And if you do not have a UC, a utilization certificate that gets loaded back into the system, then the action has not taken place. So this is the way money flows. So the school would get we discovered that the amount of money that the school actually has to spend on its own, out of the 20,000 crore budget for Sarva Shiksha Abhiyan, at the time it used to be called the school education program, it was some minimal 7,500, 11,000 rupees, something within that range. So it's all tied, and you can only spend this on school maintenance and school development. And there also you're told you can spend X on buying a mat for the children to sit, Y for the blackboard, Z amount for the chalks and so on, all accounting nicely tied so that there's no corruption. And the orders will come from the top. So we discovered that this building list school that took us a while to find because there was no building, in fact, had spent its school development grant on purchasing a fire extinguisher. Now, it was a very logical reason why they had to purchase a fire extinguisher. There was a fire in a private aided school in Kumbakonam in Tamil Nadu. While the midday meal was being prepared, and it was, a small pokey space, no fire safety equipment, unfortunately, young children lost their lives in that fire. It is appalling and abhorrent that you have schools that do not have fire safety extinguishers, especially when you have a kitchen that is going to be cooking the midday meal scheme. So Government of India, in its wisdom, rightly said all schools must have fire safety extinguishers. But if you're sitting in Delhi, heck, you won't know that in Purnia, Bihar, there's one building list school. But you will issue an order. Which cannot catch fire. You will issue an order. Now, the school knows if I do not produce that UC, I will not get the next tranche of money. So, finally, that order took a couple of years to get down to the school because that happened a while ago and we are talking about 2013. But it gets there. And so the order comes, they buy they get the UC. What they did in between, you and I, God only will know. Okay, we can all guess. That is how the money was spent. Now, can you tell me whether the school needed a fire extinguisher? No. Was it the job of the district collector to know this? Probably not. The panchayat would know. And if we empowered the panchayat to say there's 7,500 rupees, not a small amount of money, frankly, even though for us it might seem small, you can use it to buy some interesting books for the children to read. You can use it to get an extra volunteer teacher to do some remedial teaching for the children. You could do many things that would serve the core purpose of why the children and the teacher were sitting under a tree. Instead, we disempowered the local government. Somebody sitting somewhere in the name of not allowing corrupt local things to do the corrupt local activities is telling you what to do, and you get money spent into nothing where the corruption certainly happened. And the worst element of all of this is that it feeds an even worse vicious cycle within the culture of the bureaucracy. Everything is so centralized that I will only act when I am told to act, and for the rest, it is complete rest in comfortable conditions. So you know how government is all about acronyms. So all the positions are also acronyms. So in school education, there used to be a position called CRCC, Cluster Resource Center Coordinator, always referred to as CRCC, senior teacher who used to be in charge of 15 schools. So this is how they describe this. आप क्या करते हैं? मैडम हमारा तो complete rest in comfortable conditions. ऊपर से आदेश आता है तो उसका कागज ऊपर भेजना होता है तो हम काम कर लेते हैं. बाकी कोई देखता नहीं है, कोई पूछता नहीं, हम complete rest in comfortable conditions. You and I will say, look at that corrupt officer just sitting over there doing nothing. But think about it. You've created a culture and a structure of governance in which you're actually actively disempowering occurring, and you're never going to ask that local official what actually is happening in your schools. You're going to say, UC banaya ki nahi, because you have to report further up into your own hierarchy. So you've created this vicious cycle in the name of accountability that actually takes the institution away from its core purpose and makes it completely unaccountable for what it is supposed to deliver. And the ordinary citizen is looking at all of this saying, yeah, I'm going to vote, but I really am not expecting much out of this. Where if I have the resources, I will put my child into a private school. I don't want to, but I will. And for the rest, I'm going to have to live with this and shrug my shoulders. So, corruption kind of leads us into all kinds of vicious cycles that have in some ways brought us to this very sad pass in some senses.
So, the centralization example you gave, it's almost like a Kafkaesque thing where, I mean, it might seem a bit funny, but the lives of these children have got impacted, right? I mean, and then their children and so on and so forth. You've brought up this, much pilloried IAS officer quite a few times, whoever he is. May he be well or she well, but I wanted to actually come to the IAS. The IAS is a very, very unique thing globally. It's clearly a sort of a child of the ICS. Is that in any way holding India back, the fact that we have this elite permanent bureaucracy which has its own interests sometimes, right, to protect?
Well, look, in its on first principles, a meritocratic bureaucracy that brings the best of the best through a highly competitive process is to be in the state and to do public service. Can be hugely beneficial, and link it back to corruption. Isn't it really interesting that almost every bit of Indian society has gone through moments of deep corruption, scandals, etc. But to the extent that there is a process that is broadly still recognized as genuinely competitive and genuinely meritocratic, affirmative action, etc., set aside for a moment, but the UPSC exam itself, it is that. Of course, there are, there'll be scandals of cheating, etc., every now and again, but broadly, it is seen as broadly a fair system into which the best of the best come. I think the issue is not. We can quibble about the nature of the selection process, the way in which it's done, the kind of people the kind of skills that it privileges, and whether those skills are fit to purpose, particularly for 21st century governance.
When we say meritocratic, what is the UPSC measure for?
So, but I think the bigger issue is this. I think that in our founding moment, the task of nation building was in some senses handed over to this Mandarin bureaucracy that was meant to be insulated from social forces in ways. So distance from society was an extremely important part of the original design in order for the IAS to perform its functions. And we loaded a lot on the state. The state was to be the vehicle of social progress. It was to take, after all, Ambedkar says he worries about constitutional morality. We've kind of imposed democracy on a society that is fundamentally undemocratic. It is now the state has to go through the process of quote unquote making society democratic. And in that sense, that the power for social transformation is kind of placed on the bureaucracy. And in order for it to do that, with some good reason, it is meant to be centralized, distant, insulated. And that is where you have the IAS as a small but powerful cadre, and the state cadres kind of come in the bottom of the rung, and you have a mix of outsiders and insiders that within a state that people each cadre, precisely to be able to allow for this kind of independence. And in conversations with a lot of IAS officers, they have pointed to the merits of that. If I have to do land reform, which is essentially about extracting land from, taking away from powerful actors and redistributing it in society, there are a lot of pulls and pressures and forces, so that insulation from society plays a role in enabling this to happen. But one of the consequences of that is that it's an overly empowered structure, and in that overly empowered structure, it's overly centralized, which kind of makes it impossible for it to be fit to purpose. So it's sort of like taking your India socket when you go off to the US and then trying to plug it in, because there was a purpose to its design, but it is limited its ability then to be genuinely responsive to the complexities of society. And as society has evolved, the role of government has also evolved. We talk a lot about this in the context of 21st century governance. So technology, complexities of regulation, etc. As the economy gets more a modern economy is a more complex economy, the role of the state evolves and changes. But even if you think about core developmental functions, we loaded these core developmental functions onto the state, and as the economy developed, citizen expectation of the state also increased. So the state could not get away by being a tiny welfare state or almost a non-existent welfare state. It had to expand and it had to provide, and so we've loaded all of that on the state, but we haven't done anything to really reimagine it in a way that would move it from this centralized silo-driven architecture that was its original design into one that can be genuinely responsive to the sets of tasks that it has been given. And those sets of tasks are not just what you and I would imagine of a shiny 21st century digitized society that requires state to move, but even very basic things that we expect state to do, like education, health, basic public services.
And also, when you said that it's sort of isolated from society and politics, maybe that was the design, but it's really not true anymore, right? In a way, politics has got to the IS. In fact, if strongmen politicians and strongwomen politicians love to rule via the IS, they'll pick 2 or 3 favorites, and this goes from Mr. Modi to Mamata, it sort of cuts across the aisle, right? It's such a convenient way to do politics.
Yes, I mean, look, it's a long and complex story, but the politicization of the bureaucracy is a well-known reality. It is the reason I say it's a long and complex story is because I think we tend to paint this brush as people are greedy, people are willing to, but I think it's actually a lot more complex. One of the realities of one of the most powerful things that democracy has given us as a society has been this mobilization from below of marginalized communities, of parts of our we are such an unequal society. The violence of the state has been experienced by so many, yet the state is the only source of power. And so in some senses democracy mobilized parts of society used the powers of democracy to get their voices heard, and through a democratic process access state and state power. But it was access of state and state power that was their way of claiming dignity, status and position within society, because the state was such an overwhelming presence. And in some sense that became the driving logic of state, and that's opened the door for politicization and corruption. I just want us, those who are listening, to not paint this in black and white. It is a very complex picture. Some of it is a kind of complex consequence of some of the best things that democracy has done. And the answer is not to wish away democracy, but the answer is to kind of use democratic means to push for something better. I mean, look, remember Transfer Raj in UP? That was your classic example of how the core political neutrality, the principle of political neutrality that's baked into the relationship between the IAS and the politician completely gets overridden.
When you say Transfer Raj, what do you mean quickly?
There were, a pliant district magistrate or a pliant secretary kept his or her position. One that wasn't so would be transferred out within 3 months. So there was this whole phase in the
some
1990s
boondocks
and
backward
2000s.
beyond, yeah.
Yes, and a lot of studies have been done on this phenomenon of transfer Raj. In fact, one of the really interesting things about the present moment is that you've seen a movement away from that, and there's more stability now, even in UP.
Right.
You will see a lot more stability, through the course of the
So
tenure.
this idea of transferring as punishment, you think, is coming down?
I think it is coming down, but you have to ask whether it's coming down because pliance has increased or it's coming down because we are, principle on first principles of accountability.
Right. So people have learned how to play the game.
I am not commenting on that, but it's for us to wonder.
So this you raise a very fascinating point. This idea that there's this sort of subaltern surge. I remember when Lalu Prasad Yadav became Chief Minister of Bihar, one of his biggest political moves was to humiliate IAS officers. This idea that there is this guy coming from a marginalized caste, and very often IAS officers would be from forward caste, they'd be Brahmins or Kayas in Bihar. And that was such a strong political signal that he sent out. I don't know what personal grounds, whether he had any with those particular officers, but it was almost a point that he made that he has been elected, he is the executive, they are his subordinates and they will listen to him.
So, one of the most fascinating studies I read, and one of the authors was a former, an IAS officer from Bihar who was on sabbatical at IDS Sussex. The puzzle he had was this. So, in the Lalu years, the government of India had also in order to meet the goal of universalization of education, had launched the Sarva Shiksha Abhiyan. And the Sarva Shiksha Abhiyan was a centrally sponsored scheme. Large amount of money was now becoming available to achieve the goal of universalization of education, setting up schools, hiring teachers, etc. There was a sort of mini revolution in a sense that had unfolded then in the country. And the puzzle was that every time Bihar would go to Government of India meetings, Government of India would berate Bihar for there is money, it is unspent, why are you not hiring more teachers? And to sum up a complex argument, the challenge was the following: the teachers, so the qualifications for teachers, you have to go through B.Ed degrees, etc. So basically, the teachers came from the upper caste. This is a subaltern revolution that is seeking to bring those who until now did not have access to state and state power into. I mean, there is nothing more powerful and beautiful than that, if think about it. But it did mean that there were no teachers to hire, and so it was so the kind of tacit decision was, we just will not hire teachers for a period of time. It in some senses it atrophied state capacity at a time when many other states were kind of in an expansion mode. But in another way of looking at it is this was a core outcome of a particular type of mobilization from below that is extremely important and essential to challenge power hierarchies within society. So sometimes you get outcomes that you would never have imagined. I think the challenge for when we think about reason why there is less appetite for all of this in society now is also because the politics of dignity didn't convert as fast as we would have liked into a politics of social and economic rights of all. And it is that transformation that we were seeking, but it never got fulfilled, and it fed our broader societal disenchantment, which has kind of got us to this pass.
But I really think it's a testament to Indian democracy, Yamini, that Indian democracy would absorb the energies that came out of Bihar in the early 90s. And the worst thing that happened was maybe teachers weren't enough or whatever. Like, I think it could have been a lot worse given the scale of the injustice that we saw for God knows hundreds and thousands of years. If that consciousness came up in many other places, it might have led to far worse, let's say, anything. Indian democracy could absorb it and channel it in a democratic way, which I think is quite remarkable.
No, absolutely. I mean, these are all This is all the complex realities of democracy in a hard place. And, when we gained independence and we went down the route of being a democratic country, few in the Western world were willing to take a bet on us surviving as a democracy all the way to. That's why it's so precious. We've held on, and it has brought new challenges. I think of it more as its success has presented us with more challenges, and the answer to those challenges should not be what we often the trap we often fall into, a trap of disenchantment. It should be an opportunity to think differently. So our answers to state capacity are not going to, and to push the state to actually deliver on its core public goods to all citizens, are not going to come from the West or anywhere else. They're going to come from us by understanding what we are and how different pulls and pressures are being placed on the state. The Indian state is a very different state to any other because of the nature of India and Indian democracy. And so state capacity has to be thought of much more as a co-evolutionary, iterative process.
A constant back and
forth. It's something and it will only be achieved by constantly allowing for prizing open spaces for state and society to interact. And of course, I'm not being romantic about it. The state is a coercive actor. It has monopoly on violence. It's certainly not benign in how it engages with society. But the answers will only come from pressures that society brings up, which is why I believe so much in decentralization, which is why I believe in democratic accountability claim making from the bottom up, mechanisms like social audits, right to information, transparency. These are all so critical to ensuring that we shift the terms in which citizens and society engage with each other, so that these are terms that are essentially based on rights and duties and core fundamental notions of purpose of state and citizenship rather than anything else. So don't give up on democracy is the message I want to give, and to think about state capacity not as something that can be built without society. It has to be something that has to be built with society, but in iterative ways that recognize our complexity, and it will be unique and it will be different.
We started off with a big talking point, corruption. I want to end up the podcast with another big talking point, freebies or welfare, right? So the middle class in India, we love to rail against freebies, freeloaders and so on. Do you want to break it down for us?
Oh, every time a tax break goes for the middle class, this is a welcome contribution to the Indian economy. A virtuous cycle of demand will kick in. Every time a so-called freebie, which in my view are welfare schemes that are announced, oh my God, this is a freebie that will fall into the trap of corruption. The Indian state is so useless. This is not how we build an economy. That is how we talk about it. That is exactly what is at the heart of a very core problem with Indian society. There are two ways of thinking about it. I'm going to focus on the second because lots of people talk about the first. The first part of this is essentially about the deep inequalities that are baked into our society and how that breaks solidarities. I want to push us in a different direction because it's connected to all the corruption and state talk we've had so far. A deeply corrupt state creates this other vicious cycle. And again, I'm going to borrow from a fun title of a paper with Lant, which I happen to have the privilege of co-authoring with him. The title of the paper was Taxes, Tribute to the Leviathan or a Necessary Price of Civilization. An incompetent state often allows for this idea that taxes are by definition an extractive act. But I'm willing to benignly pay my taxes to the state because it is a price I am paying for civilization. I will get roads. I will not have to be stuck in a traffic jam for 7 hours if I live in Gurgaon on a day that it's raining. I will not be puddling through sewer water just because there's a light rain, or or have to pay huge amounts of money for a private school because the public school system isn't working, because I am paying a price for civilization. But in incompetent and corrupt state, you think of your taxes not as a price of civilization, but as a tribute to the Leviathan. It's money that is being given given to the despot leader to use to serve their own interests rather than the interests of society. And it is that mindset that constantly allows us to look at acts of the state as acts that are essentially further entrenching corruption, and taking away from me, rather than as necessary functions of a state that is obligated to provide, to ensure that human capability of all is built, and we have a society in which we offer economic opportunity to all. I prey on this point because it shaped our mindset post-liberalization. The tentacles of the state in License Raj and the corruption that it had unleashed essentially moved us in the broad, what was the broad zeitgeist of the 1991 moment? Get the state out of the way. Allow the animal forces to be unleashed and you will see the state is the problem. And so and that suited the elites, because after all, we all benefited from precisely that. In the urge to get the state out of the way, we saw anything that the state did as entrenching the state and as something that would essentially take away from us via our taxes, which we felt which we justified in this account of the state being so corrupt that my taxpayer money is going to further further the corrupt state rather than some broad public good. So it basically broke the foundations of the social contract. And in breaking the foundations of the social contract, it allows for this easy and lazy discourse of freebies and raveries. And I think, to me, the freebies and raveries are less of a problem. The real challenge is that it has legitimized a narrative within the state and in our politics that welfare is essentially best delivered without investing in the public system. So what are the big so-called freebies and raveries that we are offering today? What is welfare politics in India? It is cash transfers. That's because, and technology has allowed us to do this. I've done a lot of work on why that is sort of feeding the authoritarian beast in some senses.
Like for example, cash transfer to women.
Look, don't get me wrong. I would much rather cash transfers for women than another tax break that would suit one Mr. A sitting right on top. Right. Okay, any investment that we make in our people is a good investment. But we have to ask ourselves, in the world of limited resources, why are we only making one type of investment and not another? The reason why this investment is necessary is because you're producing an economy. You have an economy that is simply not delivering and creating opportunities for all, and the state has to. Therefore, I draw so much on Ratin Roy's very wonderful way of describing it. We've moved from a developmental state to a compensatory state, just handing out cash because the state is not being able to build and invest in its people in a way that.
So to break it down, for example, in a more idealized welfare system, the state would, for example, build a hospital or a school. Really good hospital, schools,
investments in the system,
which would build human capacity,
and it would also do social safety nets like cash transfers, but linked into empowering the citizens both to participate in the labor market and to exit out of the labor market when they need. So maternity benefits, pensions, all of these are core and critical part and parcel of what. But when you're doing it in an economy that's neither investing in people nor generating jobs, it effectively performs the function of being a compensatory state. And it's all legitimized. What have we celebrated the most in the last 10 years? We are now on the path to a 21st century digital future state. We are this logistical marvel that is sending so much cash down to our poorest. Great, but we should expect a lot more from the Indian state. We should expect that the state actually fulfills its core constitutional mandate of delivering on socio-economic rights of people. We are citizens, not recipients of cash. And as citizens, it is our right to demand and the obligation of the state to ensure that it provides us with basic, high-quality public goods. No country in the world has achieved miracle growth, which is what we are hoping our tax breaks and GST rationalization will give us. No country has achieved that without investing in its people, and our consistent failure to do so has a lot to do with many things: the nature of our society, the choices we made at independence for the kind of developmental state we wanted to be, but also where we have ended up now, which is we have got so disenchanted with the state that we would rather it just drops a little bit of cash and leave everything else and hope that somehow that will lead us to the pathway of being a global superpower. It's not going to happen. Lose your disenchantment, use democratic means to hold the state accountable and demand more of the state. Miracles can happen, and India's states, if you look at its variety, tell you that this can actually happen. Kerala, Tamil Nadu, great examples. Even in even in the bad lands of Bihar, of Uttar Pradesh, there are pockets of amazing success when the state invests in itself. How much it can achieve for people, and we as citizens must demand that of our state.
I want to come up on one example. For example, it was a legitimate aim for the Indian state to build better public hospitals. But in the last decade or so, at least politically, that's been taken over by giving health insurance, which is great, except the health insurance is money going to private hospitals. So you actually
government hospitals are impaneled.
Are both, but you can also get treatment done in a private hospital. And in fact, from what I've seen in my reporting, most people would prefer that there was insurance plus a private hospital, because usually they sometimes might be better than public hospitals, right? They will want to come to a city and go to a private hospital for some reason. And this to me seems like a really disastrous turn of events, except at that point, I can also see why a politician would push for it, because beyond a point, it's very difficult to get good public hospitals up and running. And at that moment, you can go to the voter and say, "Oh, I'm going to give you I'm going to give you a 5 lakh health insurance cover. So vote for me."
And yet you have lots of really phenomenal examples of when we have invested in the state. You see, so the National Health Mission created a whole cadre of ASHA workers. There are complexities, but without a doubt, that has been one of the most transformational investments we have made in public health. Tamil Nadu will tell you, Kerala will tell you, invest in the primary health system, it actually does work. So it isn't the health and wellness centers that were part of the, when the PMJAY. So there's so many acronyms now, they get muddled up. The health insurance, Ayushman Bharat, health and wellness centers were also set up. These health and wellness centers, by some of the evaluations I have seen, actually some of them are doing really well. So I do look, it is no doubt it's a corrupt state, it's an incompetent state, it is a complex reality. The socio-economic context in which democracy has unfolded has thrown its own miracles as well as burdens. But in the middle of all of this, where you see investments that have been made in the state, you actually see important and powerful outcomes. And I think the real, we've always puzzled over this question: how is it that a democracy and a robust and successful democracy, warts and all notwithstanding, has never brought education and health at the core investments in people at the center of its political story? I think the Aam Aadmi Party in Delhi was really interesting because it actively sought political legitimacy on the back of what it did in schools in Delhi. Now, we can quibble over what actually happened, good, bad, etc.
But at least that's what they wanted to do.
In that, it sought if you look closely at electoral data, you may or may not be able to see causality between investments in schools and election outcomes, but that's not the point. The narrative shift of possibility that the state can invest in schools and actually produce high quality schools is really powerful. And it is a tragedy that our disenchantment with the state has meant that it is very comfortable for everybody to.
In fact, this AAP narrative that you're talking about, I've seen a reflection of that across India. The last time I was covering Telangana, I met a kulfi seller, I think in Hyderabad, who out of the blue said, "Aapne school banaya." Again, whether that fact is true or not, but at least the narrative was put out in such a way that to him it seemed like an aspirational idea in which, because no party in Telangana was really talking about it in any real way. I want to come back to the middle class freebie thing. Does the middle class not get any freebies from the state? Do they not benefit from the state?
Income tax budget 2025. Do I need to say any more? Look, I mean, I think so I think there are two issues. we have not, there's historical reasons, there's the choices that we made, etc. There's the nature of our society, but we do fundamentally lack a sense of solidarity on the back of which the welfare state ought to be developed, right? And I think that is what plays out in this constant narrative of freebies and raveries. And that narrative of freebies and raveries gets fed and legitimized on the back of our general disenchantment with the state, and this broader narrative of get the state out of the way and allow the animal spirits to do whatever it has to do. It allows for this comfort of us to then say, yeah, this is all freebies, but a tax break is part and parcel of, kickstarting the virtuous demand cycle of the economy. The Indian economy has a structural demand constraint. This is not going to be solved by tax breaks. We have a problem in that we have a stagnant structural transformation. Most societies see people moving from agriculture out. We are seeing people moving from agriculture into precarious informality and now increasingly going back to agriculture. It is a larger issue about the nature of our economy, the way in which the economy has grown post-liberalization, etc., which is perhaps a whole other conversation. But I think fundamentally it is a story of broken solidarities and that are fed by this beast of a state that hasn't delivered, which creates this vicious cycle of disenchantment.
Like, unlike China, Southeast Asia, we haven't been able to, say, build mass manufacturing. We can pull these people out from ag.
Which, by the way, we're also, there's a foundation of, and it faltered a little bit, but it's being rebuilt, of a very robust public investment in people. China's education, health, East Asia, there's the comparisons are.
I think the data is clear. I think by the time Nehru and Mao died, China had achieved almost full primary education. And
I mean, yeah, that goes back to, the choices we made that we did not invest in.
Like, it's fascinating. We invested in higher education, in such high quality higher education.
Yes, the kind of technocratic, high modernist imagination of the bureaucracy. We talked about the nature of the IAS and the centralized bureaucratic structure. But, look, we can go back to our past. It's very important to understand the choices we made, to get a better sense of why we are here. But I think a more useful, forward-looking place to end up is in asking, this is what we are. We need to understand why we got here. But how do we move forward, not by giving up, but by understanding that the future lies in a process of iterative co-evolution. And this sounds like slightly weird, big words, but how do we leverage that the health and wellness centers are working in a way that can create narrative shifts in our minds and an interest and desire for greater public investment that will see outcomes, that can kickstart. So if you want to kickstart a virtuous cycle of demand in the economy, why are we not talking about kickstarting a virtuous cycle of accountability in our governance? We are, of course, distracted by many other issues, but don't allow the one nationism to become the answer to this governance challenge. Think about how you can use democracy and sites of deliberation to kickstart these and to leverage the successes we have and really push for more accountability to scale up these successes. If you can do a health and wellness center, if you can have the ASHA worker now as part and parcel of what makes for the health system, why can't you get the primary health center to work? If you and it does also need, and let's not forget that it needs an openness to understanding realities, to data, to research, to critique, to feedback. Without all of these pieces, you will not know what's happening on the ground, you will not be held accountable for what's happening on the ground, and you will not be able to iterate to find answers.
On that note, Yamini, thank you so much for this. This was a fascinating conversation.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for watching, viewers. This is Shoaib Daniel on Scroll Adda. If you like the work that Scroll does, follow our YouTube channel and subscribe to Scroll.